and I'm going to try to speak without the, I guess it's going to pick me up, right? I don't like to lean in. Okay. I keep telling my wife I'm an intellectual, by the way. Very pleased to be addressing you tonight. Thanks to Charlie and Carl for the gracious invitation, to Eugenie Bouillet for shepherding me through this whole process. And the title of, I'll be brief tonight, the title of my keynote address, Literature Without Borders, Why Translation Matters, you may have already noticed, echoes two relatively recent contributions to the burgeoning field of literary translation. The phrase before the colon, Literature Without Borders, it invokes the website Words Without Borders, in which it's not difficult to hear the phonic similarity to World Without Borders, an idealistic vision of a future global community where translators and interpreters have managed to break down barriers of communication between the world's linguistically and culturally diverse citizenry. This wonderful site has made literature from around the world available in English rendering since 2003, and its mission statement, if it can be called that, affirms that translation through Words Without Borders, quote, opens doors to international exchange. With this, I hasten to assume that we all fully agree that the role of literary translation as a vital component of the human family's continued cultural contact and mutual understanding cannot be overestimated. My keynote's subtitle, Why Translation Matters, happens to be the exact words that Edith Grossman uses for her 2010 volume published by Yale University Press, which began as a series of talks she presented at this prestigious university's Whitney Center. For Grossman, literary translation matters as much for the laudable goal of cross-cultural communication as for its fulfillment of an aesthetic need she believes all individuals share. She writes, and this is an extended quote, I believe translation matters for the same reasons and the same way that literature matters, because it is crucial to our sense of ourselves as human beings. The artistic impulse and the need for art in our species will not be denied. It has been with us from almost the beginning of our history, and despite profound changes in culture, customs, and expectations, it remains with us all over the world in a variety of guises. Where literature exists, translation exists. Of course, literary translation and translation in general have mattered in different ways in different cultures and historical periods. Translation has variously been used, for example, as a rhetorical exercise in Roman times for perfecting original compositions, or as a way to highlight semantic essence through the rendering of poetry into prose during the Romantic period, since it was thought that artistic genius could not be interlingually conveyed by an approximation of original verse forms, and when considered collectively and comparatively as a means of messianically glimpsing a kind of lost Ur language. As a practitioner of literary translation, mostly of poetry from Spanish, for some 30 years now, I don't flinch at Grossman's humanistic take on translation either. In my personal efforts to introduce or reacquaint readers with writers who are unknown, obscure, or neglected, even in their own cultures, I often find myself using the word rescue, by which I mean a snatching from oblivion of authors whose art and ideas I believe merit wider dissemination. This effort pales in comparison, though, with the daily deeds of working translators and interpreters in the fields of, not in the fields of literature, whose real-world feats of rescue in hospital settings, immigration hearings, legal trials, and the like can and do have life or death consequences. I feel comfortable with the metaphors of access and transfer that typify translational discourse, including the opening of doors and the building of bridges. And having recently had occasion to revisit the website of the American Literary Translators Association, I was reminded that the very organization of which I serve as president believes that it, quote, bridges cultural communication and understanding among countries and languages through the art and craft of literary translation. In an ever-shrinking world that science and technology insist on making smaller each day, the growing need for translation, literary or otherwise, just cannot be ignored. I'm going to quote David Bellows here. I'm glad I'm doing it favorably because he's here. In a chapter titled, Is Translation Avoidable?, In his marvelous book, I did not just put that in, it is a marvelous book, Is That a Fish in Your Ear? David Bellos actually seems to answer the question in the affirmative until he lays out the stark choices such a situation would present. Instead of using translation, he writes, quote, we could learn the languages of all the different communities we wish to engage with. Or we could decide to speak the same language or else adopt a single common language for communicating with other communities. But if we balk at adopting a common language and decline to learn the other languages we need, we could simply ignore people who don't speak the way we do. In other words, opting to live in a world without translation is simply untenable. Bellos' own cheeky subtitle, Translation and the Meaning of Everything, underscores again translation's ineluctable centrality. It seems superfluous at this stage to remind you that the European Union alone publishes its documents in the 23 official and working languages of its 27 member states. That's daily. That was a little professorial. So I'm shifting to the negative here. I was trying to catch Eugenie Brier's eye, and so she told me to keep it upbeat. But I also know that translation matters because people say such bad things about it. Wearing my other hat as an academic and self-proclaimed expert in the field of translation studies, I can come across a litany of pejorative analogies for translation in the translation studies canon almost at a glance. Perhaps you're familiar with some of the more unflattering ones, in which translation is likened variously to such activities and conditions as terrorism, ethnocide, imperialism, forgery, sexual aggression, and narcissism. These, in some cases, violent comparisons undoubtedly inhere lesson language pairings such as French-English and my own, Spanish-English, in either direction, where questions of cultural hegemony and respect for the other, particularly the subaltern, are more muted. Yet even when the metaphors are not quite so vituperative, they can remain nefarious, as is the case with one of my favorites, in which Philip Stratford describes the translator as a smuggler. Here's the quote. I only included this because I thought it would amuse you. And here it goes. Paradoxically, although for his own purposes he has decided that frontiers do not exist, and although he works in a sense to eliminate boundaries, the translator depends on them absolutely. He trades on the existence of frontiers and his own facility in crossing them. He is by necessity a man of divided allegiances, neither flesh nor fowl, a lonely, shadowy character, mistrusted by everyone, and probably envied a little in a covert way too, for more positively, he stands for freedom, risk, excitement, and adventure. An aura of envy has always hung over the smuggler, and a lot of this is also due to the translator. Yes, even as he or she opens doors and builds bridges, the translator can remain shrouded in suspicion, as those not proficient in both of the languages between which he or she moves must take on faith the accuracy of the rendering or interpretation. Critics have repeatedly pointed out one of the great ironies inherent in this transaction, namely that those individuals best situated to judge the correspondence of a translation to its source text are precisely those who are in least need of it. As you well know, the history of interpretation is rife with figures that have entered popular lore for their manipulation of utterances to serve the purposes of this or that group or interest. I take it to be no coincidence that these dubious views of the translator have largely arisen as the field of translation studies moves away from a sustained examination of correlation. As Susan Basnett, one of the founders of the discipline, writes somewhat offhandedly in a foreword to Edwin Genster's 2008 volume, Translation and Identity in the Americas, New Directions in Translation Theory, quote, you'll hear a little bit of academic discourse here, Gensler boldly suggests that where once translation was seen as a rhetorical form that was somehow underpinned by a yearning for some unified original essence, it is now increasingly being seen as a discursive practice that reveals multiple signs of the polyvalence with which cultures are constructed. I would hazard to guess, though, that the brilliant translations of fiction and nonfiction that yielded the finalists for tonight's award ceremony were judged almost entirely on their nimble correlation and adept rephrasing in accordance with contemporary conventions of translation, which hold that a translation should sound like an original piece of writing and adhere mostly to the prevailing codes of target culture, discourse, and aesthetics. Their excellent work attests to why translation matters when undertaking following an accepted methodology. That is, a tacit agreement between translator and reader that removes efforts such as theirs from the realm of public distrust. And for this, they're all to be commended. And I am going to end now. I would end, please, in an interrogative mode by suggesting yet another way translation might matter in years to come. I recently revisited this idea, on which I've written fleetingly, and I mean fleetingly. When I wrote on it once, one of the reader's reports came back, this part baffles me. So, I revisited the idea when answering a question I was posed in an interview for Foundation Forum, which is the online newsletter of this foundation. I was asked, when asked what translation might do in the face of the world's rapidly disappearing linguistic diversity, I responded something to the effect of probably not as much as the recording of lexica and grammars. But as the pendulum inevitably swings away from current translational practice toward the favoring of a foreignizing methodology over today's rage for naturalization, these no longer living languages will be afforded their own sort of rescue, surviving through translation, where traces of what would have been their otherwise lost syntaxes, semantics, phonetics, and artistic forms will survive in host languages that really are the bridges and doors to a cultural past. In this way, translation will assume yet another role that will assure it remains not only relevant, but indispensable to a global community in which readers of translation will be forever reminded of, if not their universal sameness, at least their common humanity. Thank you.